Hello everyone, it's Jason again, and today I have another bird oil painting video to show you guys. And in this video, I want to show you my thought process from start to finish of this bird painting. I'm not an oil painting expert by any means, so this isn't intended to be some sort of tutorial video, but hopefully by going through my experience painting this, you'd be able to learn something from it. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So with every bird painting that I do, I start with a line drawing, and I'll be using the grid method. At the beginning of the video, you saw me drawing the lines on the panel, and I've already measured these out beforehand and made sure that they lined up with the reference photo that I have here. I use the grid method because I want the drawing to be as accurate as possible. Although I'm pretty confident with drawing without using a grid, I just wanted to minimize the errors that I would make if I was just eyeballing everything. The main objective of the sketch is to get the position and the size of the bird correct in frame. As you can see here, I only drew a very simple silhouette because that's pretty much all that I need to start the painting. I'm now erasing some of the lines that I'm not going to be using anymore. In my experience, the paint can sometimes smudge the graphite of the pencil and leave like nasty marks. I also did this super quick value sketch so I know where the light and shadow areas go in the painting. So that's all the prep work done, now it's time to paint. The first step is staining the canvas. I'm using burnt sienna here to give it a nice warm undertone. Just a very thin layer here. I don't want the panel to end up being too dark. And after that's done, we can actually start the painting. I decided to paint the background first, so I'm squeezing out the colors that I'm gonna need for the background, which is a very light, pale yellowish green color. In my head, I've already separated the painting into three main layers, and that's the background, and then the foliage that's also in the background, and then there's the bird and the branch. So I'm starting with the furthermost layer first. It's essentially just a very subtle gradient where it's lighter at the top right and it gets darker and cooler towards the bottom left. So I tried to mix colors as closely as I could to the reference photo and started to block the colors in. After smoothing out the gradient, I move on to the next layer, where I use darker paint to suggest some of the foliage and the leaves and the branches in the background. And here I decided not to follow the reference exactly. It's just not practical to try to replicate every single detail, and it's just going to take a lot of time. So instead, I tried to place these leaves in places where I feel like it would serve the composition of the painting. I was having some trouble mixing the colors that are required for this stage. The colors weren't very intuitive. You'd expect twigs and branches to be brown, but from the reference photo, I see that most of them are just a very muddy gray or blue or sometimes even purple. I spent quite a lot of time on this background. I messed around with different shapes, colors, values, just to try to make things look organic. In the beginning, it's just a lot of random shapes, but as I worked on it more, I began to cut into these shapes and started to refine them and create a more definite sense of form. And eventually, I got to a stage that I'm pretty happy with. I knew that I could leave the background pretty loose because the main focal point of the painting is going to be the bird. And now it's time to paint the bird. So this bird is pretty tricky to paint because it's black and white. I find that when you're painting birds with black feathers, you're gonna have to work with a very tight value range. And one of the big challenges is starting with the correct shade of black. You want to use a shade that's dark enough so that the viewer knows that it's still a black bird, but at the same time you want to leave yourself room to be able to go darker so that you can paint in the shadow areas of the bird. And it's the exact same thing with the white feathers as well. I'd say that the white feathers are even more difficult to paint than the black feathers, because it's never gonna be pure white. The feathers are gonna be catching and reflecting a lot of light from the environment, so in this case, it would look a bit more green or yellowish, and the challenge is gonna be showing some of that color, but also trying to keep it subtle. I'm paying a lot of attention to the value sketch that I used earlier, as well as the reference photo, and I'm using them like as a map so that I know where to put all of the different values. Here I'm using a very muted blue that's a bit lighter than the shade of black that I was using, so that I could block in the top of the head. I'm now putting in the last few sections of the bird that are black, and then I'm going to move on to the white feathers. I decided to start with the black first because the white feathers are actually overlapping on top of the black feathers, so it's going to be easier when you're working back to front. Also, I just find it easier to lay a lighter paint on top of darker paint. Now I'm painting the little belly of the bird, and I'm shading it in a way where it exaggerates the form of the bird. From my experience, when you do that, it really makes the bird pop out of the painting. And now I'm working on the tail. I'm surprised that there were so many layers of feathers down there. And finally, I paint in the bird's little shoulder pads. The white paint here is going to be the brightest because it's catching the most sunlight. I was very nervous about painting the beak, so I decided to work on the little stick first. I'm using very thick paint here again because I want to make sure that it really pops out of the background. And finally I get around to painting the beak. It was quite difficult because the paint in the background is still kind of wet, so I had no place to rest my hand. My hands are usually very shaky, so trying to hover with the brush and paint like this is very nerve-wracking. Using some very creative hand positions, I finally managed to block in the rest of the beak. And since I'm working with a tiny brush now, I'm just taking the time to put in all the other little details. And this is actually my favorite part of every painting. It's painting in these contact shadows. They really emphasize the overlap that's happening in between all of the layers, and it makes your painting just look more realistic. At this stage, the painting really starts to slow down. I'm taking my time to fix all of the inaccuracies and the carelessness of using the bigger brush to block things in. I'm really paying attention to the reference photo to make sure all the angles and proportions are correct. And while painting the details, I have to make decisions whether or not to leave things in or to remove them from my painting. In this case, the tail area, while there is a lot of detail in the reference photo, I decided to leave some of it out because it's not the main focal point of the image, so I try to keep things simple down there. And now I move back to painting the stick. I like to jump around the painting because it keeps things interesting for me. I noticed that there's a lot of diminishing returns when I spend too much time on one section of the painting. It's usually just more productive to move on and work on different parts of the painting so that I can make sure that the level of finish is more uniform. I got really sucked into painting the stick in the foreground. I knew that all the detail wasn't necessary, but I was having fun, so why not? And this was supposed to be the part of the video where I show myself painting the eye, but I wasn't paying attention and my camera died halfway while recording, so all that footage was never captured. Despite being such a small part of the painting, I spent so much time trying to get it right. I had to rework it so many times to get the position, the roundness, the shadows and the light, the reflection. It was a lot of things to worry about. But now with the eye done, I can focus on the other little details, especially in the beak and the feathers in the head. Just kidding. I had to put a little bit more detail in the eyes. And now I'm further refining the areas where the dark feathers meet the light feathers. These are the areas with the most contrast, so I wanted to make sure I put more time into them. And now I'm just going back and forth, just putting in a little bit more detail in areas where it's lacking. I'm painting in some stray feathers so that the bird doesn't look so perfectly uniform. The painting's almost complete now. There's just one final piece. And for all my bird paintings, this is the part I struggle with the most. It's painting the bird feet. I did include the feet in the initial sketch, but all of that drawing is already under layers of paint now, so I'm gonna have to redraw the feet. And for many of my previous bird paintings, I'd always leave the feet for last, and at that stage I'd be so tired and I just want to finish the painting, so I would be very lazy and careless. But this time I'm determined to put in more effort and try to make it look better. I'm using the smallest brush I own, and I try to keep my hand as steady as possible before laying down any paint. I'm constantly flicking back and forth from my painting and the reference photo to make sure that I have all the parts of the leg right. I really wanted to make sure that the angles of each digit and the way that it clamps around the branch was painted on as accurately as possible. This took even more concentration than it did when I was painting the eye, but it was so worth it. I'm pretty happy with how the feet turned out, and now I'm painting the final piece, the back side of this tail that's hiding behind the branch. I actually forgot about this section. I only noticed because I was painting the feet and I was paying such close attention to the reference photo. And here's the finished piece. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you learned something, feel free to leave me a like, it really helps. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.